February 1st, 2021. The heavy glass doors of 214 Oxford Street were locked for the final time. Inside, 90,000 square feet of fashion history sat in darkness. The mannequins were stripped, the neon signs switched off, and thousands of retail staff were sent home with nothing but a cardboard box. What fell that day wasn't just a clothes shop. At its peak, Topshop was the undisputed dictator of the British High Street. It boasted over 300 stores across the UK, hosted exclusive Kate Moss collections that caused chaotic queues around the block, and welcomed 100,000 shoppers a week to its London flagship alone. It was the destination teenagers saved their pocket money for, the ultimate Saturday shopping trip. 2 decades later, the physical empire collapsed into administration. The bustling aisles were permanently shuttered, the tills silenced, and the beloved brand was sold off to become merely a digital ghost on an endless scroll of internet fast fashion. How does the most powerful youth brand in the country simply vanish from the pavement? It wasn't just a sudden shift to e-commerce, and it wasn't just the pandemic. It was a toxic cocktail of billionaire greed, a catastrophic lack of investment, and a fatal loss of identity. From the bustling department store concessions of the 1960s to the devastating collapse of the Arcadia Group, the rise and fall of Topshop reveals exactly what happens when the architects of British retail culture believe they are invincible. To understand the magnitude of Topshop's eventual collapse, one must first understand the sterile retail landscape into which it was born. In the early 1960s, the concept of a teenager as a powerful economic demographic was still relatively new in Britain. The post-war gloom was finally lifting, employment was high, and for the first time in modern history, young working-class men and women had disposable income burning holes in their pockets. They were listening to the Beatles, reading about the swinging 60s, and longing for the vibrant, rebellious fashion seen in the boutiques of Chelsea's King's Road. But for a young girl living in Sheffield, Manchester, or a quiet market town, the British High Street offered no such glamour. Shopping was a strictly utilitarian, multi-generational affair. Mothers and daughters bought their clothes from the exact same department stores, places like C&A, British Home Stores, BHS, and Marks and Spencer. The offering consisted of sensible skirts, sturdy woolen knitwear, and practical coats designed to last a decade. There was no distinct youth fashion available to the masses. If a young woman wanted to dress like her idols, she largely had to make the clothes herself. The Burton Group, a tailoring giant that dominated British menswear, sensed a massive gap in the market. They owned a chain of women's department stores called Peter Robinson, which, much like its competitors, catered to a safe, middle-aged clientele. In 1964, in an attempt to capture this new, lucrative youth market, management made a quiet but revolutionary decision. They carved out a small basement concession inside the Peter Robinson branch in Sheffield, completely dedicating the space to young women's fashion. They named it Peter Robinson's Topshop. It was an immediate, resounding success. For the first time, teenage girls had a retail space that was entirely their own. The clothes were brightly colored, trend-driven, and crucially, cheaply made, so they could be bought with a week's wages and discarded when the trend inevitably passed. The music was loud, the atmosphere was chaotic, and mothers found the entire experience utterly bewildering. That, of course, was exactly the point. Topshop became a sanctuary away from the disapproving gaze of older generations. By the early 1970s, the concession model had rapidly expanded across the country. The Topshop sections were drastically outperforming the rest of the Peter Robinson department stores, generating the lion's share of the profits while occupying a fraction of the floor space. The Burton Group realized that keeping their most profitable asset chained inside an aging department store was stifling its potential. In 1974, the umbilical cord was cut. Peter Robinson was gradually phased out, and Topshop, soon to be stylized as the single word Topshop, was launched as a standalone retail chain on the British High Street. This move fundamentally altered the geography of the town centre. Topshop locations began springing up across the country, transforming the Saturday afternoon shopping trip into a cultural rite of passage. Teenagers would flock to the high street, meeting friends outside the store before diving into the crowded, neon-lit aisles. It was a highly sensory experience. The smell of cheap synthetic fabrics mixed with heavy perfume, the sound of the latest chart hits blaring from the speakers, and the physical thrill of hunting for the perfect weekend outfit amongst densely packed clothing rails. However, despite its massive commercial success throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Topshop faced a deep, underlying tension. It had successfully cornered the youth market, but the broader fashion industry viewed it with thinly veiled disdain. It was considered cheap and cheerful, a purveyor of fast, disposable fads rather than a respected authority on style. The clothes were often badly stitched, the fabrics were cheap, and the designs were unashamedly derivative of whatever was popular on television at the time. Topshop had achieved independence, and it had conquered the high street in terms of sheer footfall. It had proved that teenagers could sustain an entire retail empire on their own. Yet, as the 1990s approached, the brand found itself at a crossroads. To survive the coming decades, it couldn't just be the shop where teenagers bought cheap party tops. It needed to be taken seriously. It needed to dictate the trends, not just follow them. The foundation was firmly laid, but the true transformation, the era that would elevate Topshop from a standard high street shop to a global fashion powerhouse, was just waiting in the wings. By the mid-1990s, Topshop was a commercial juggernaut, yet it was suffering from a severe crisis of credibility. It was undeniably popular, but it was not cool. The British fashion establishment looked down upon it as a purveyor of naff, uninspired garments, a place where teenagers bought cheap, synthetic knockoffs of trends that had debuted on the Paris or Milan catwalks 6 months prior. The business model relied entirely on volume and imitation rather than innovation. But as the decade drew to a close, the cultural landscape of Britain was shifting. The Cool Britannia era was in full swing. British music and art were dominating the global stage, and a new generation of shoppers was becoming increasingly fashion-conscious. They wanted edge. They wanted originality. And they wanted it at a high street price. The catalyst for Topshop's miraculous transformation from a high street follower to a global fashion dictator arrived in the form of Jane Shepherdson. Having steadily worked her way up through the ranks of the Burton Group since the 1980s, Shepherdson was appointed brand director of Topshop in 1999. She inherited a retail chain that was profitable but philosophically stagnant. Her vision, however, was radically different from anything the British high street had ever seen. Shepherdson fundamentally believed that mass-market fashion did not have to mean compromised aesthetics. She famously despised the industry standard of lazily copying designer garments and treating the high street customer as someone with a lower standard of taste. Almost overnight, she initiated a brutal and brilliant revolution from within. Shepherdson began purging the business of its worst habits. She phased out the cheap nylon and poor-quality synthetics, demanding better fabrics, sharper tailoring, and a higher standard of finish. More importantly, she completely overhauled the design process. Instead of sending buyers to spy on European catwalks and order cheap copies from overseas factories, she began hiring fresh, ambitious design graduates directly from elite British fashion schools like Central St. Martin's. Topshop was no longer going to wait to see what the designers dictated. It was going to design the trends itself. Shepherdson empowered her buying and design teams to take risks, trusting their instincts rather than relying purely on historical sales data. One of her most masterful strokes was the introduction of the scarcity model to the high street. Previously, a popular item would be reordered by the thousands and restocked for months until everyone was wearing it, inevitably killing the trend. Shepherdson introduced limited runs. A new, cutting-edge item would arrive in shops on a Thursday, and by Saturday afternoon, it would be entirely sold out, never to be restocked. This created a frenzied sense of urgency among shoppers. Topshop suddenly felt exclusive. If a young woman saw a velvet blazer or a perfectly cut floral tea dress on the rails, she had to buy it immediately, or she would lose it forever. This strategy birthed the era of the Topshop hero item. Suddenly, British women weren't just going to Topshop to buy basics. They were hunting for the it garment of the season. The brand became synonymous with defining an entire generation's wardrobe, from the ubiquitous Baxter skinny jeans that defined the 2000s indie sleaze era to the perfect ballet pumps and the vintage-inspired dresses that became the uniform of the British festival circuit. Topshop was selling a lifestyle, an attitude, and a distinctly London-centric sense of cool. The ultimate validation of the Shepherdson revolution arrived in the early 2000s. To bridge the gap between the high street and high fashion, Topshop launched an in-house premium collection named Topshop Unique in 2001. The garments were slightly more expensive, made from premium materials, and featured avant-garde silhouettes. By 2005, something entirely unprecedented happened in British retail history. Topshop Unique was invited to show on the official schedule at London Fashion Week. It was a watershed moment. A brand that had started as a cheap basement concession in Sheffield was now sending models down the catwalk, while the formidable editor of American Vogue, Anna Wintour, and the British fashion elite sat in the front row. The snobbery that had long separated haute couture from the high street was effectively dismantled. Topshop had achieved mass prestige. It proved that a girl could buy a £30 dress, pair it with a designer handbag, and look like the most stylish person in the room. However, beneath the glittering catwalks and the soaring profits, a deep tension was brewing. Shepherdson had built a creative utopia, transforming Topshop into a respected fashion authority driven by design and culture. But Topshop was still a business, and in 2002, the wider Arcadia Group had been swallowed whole by a man whose vision for the company was rooted entirely in financial extraction rather than creative expression. The golden era of design was about to collide violently with the harsh realities of billionaire retail economics. If the Shepherdson revolution provided Topshop with a new authoritative voice, then 214 Oxford Street was its cathedral. In the mid-2000s, the brand unveiled its expanded London flagship, an awe-inspiring 90,000-square-foot labyrinth spread across 4 sprawling floors. To call it a clothes shop would be a fundamental misunderstanding of its cultural footprint. It was a destination, a social hub, and an overwhelming sensory assault that redefined what physical retail could be in the United Kingdom. Walking through the heavy glass doors of Topshop Oxford Circus was akin to stepping into the epicenter of British youth culture. It was famously loud. Resident DJs spun the latest indie rock anthems from The Strokes and Arctic Monkeys, blending with the constant, deafening chatter of thousands of teenage girls and young women. The air was a thick mix of static electricity from trying on synthetic knitwear, the smell of acetone from the in-store nail bars, and sweet perfumes sprayed liberally at the cosmetics counters. It was designed to keep shoppers trapped inside its ecosystem for an entire day. It wasn't just rails of clothing. The flagship housed a blow-dry bar, a vintage clothing bazaar, a piercing studio, piercing counters and cafés. It introduced the concept of personal shopping to the British high street, offering private suites with complimentary cupcakes and Prosecco to regular shoppers, a luxury previously reserved for the elite clientele of Harrods or Selfridges. Topshop Oxford Circus became a rite of passage, a tourist attraction in its own right. Teenage girls from regional towns in Yorkshire, the Midlands or Wales would wake up at the crack of dawn to board trains to London, treating a Saturday trip to the flagship as a sacred pilgrimage. They would gather at the entrance, mapping out their strategy before descending into the cavernous basement to hunt for the perfect Saturday night outfit. At its absolute peak, the Oxford Circus store alone was welcoming 100,000 customers through its doors every single week. It was a retail anomaly, a place where celebrities, fashion editors, and university students rubbed shoulders, all frantically digging through the same rails. The absolute zenith of this physical retail mania arrived on a balmy evening in May 2007. Topshop had achieved the ultimate coup, an exclusive clothing collaboration with the undisputed queen of British fashion, supermodel Kate Moss. This was the moment the high street and high fashion collided with explosive force. The anticipation was unprecedented. By the time the sun set over London, a colossal queue had formed, snaking down the pavements of Oxford Street and wrapping around the adjacent blocks. Thousands of young women camped out overnight, clutching coffees and waiting for the doors to open. When the launch finally happened, It was a moment of pure retail theatre. Kate Moss herself appeared in the flagship's expansive window display, modelling a red dress from the collection for the screaming crowds outside. When the security guards finally unlocked the doors, it was pandemonium. Shoppers sprinted across the shop floor, grabbing handfuls of floral tea dresses, denim cut-offs, and waistcoats without even checking the sizes. Racks were stripped entirely bare within minutes. Staff frantically tried to replenish the floor, but the sheer volume of demand was impossible to meet. For a brief, shining moment, Topshop felt like the most important place in the world. It was a cultural phenomenon that cemented the brand as an untouchable titan of the British high street. Yet, amidst the flashing cameras and the record-breaking sales figures, a dangerous illusion was taking root. The phenomenal success of the Oxford Circus Mecca created a false sense of invincibility within the boardroom. The flagship was generating staggering revenues, but it was also obscuring a fatal structural flaw. Maintaining a 90,000 square foot palace in the heart of central London required an astronomical lease, costing millions of pounds a year just in rent and business rates. It relied entirely on an unending massive volume of physical footfall. The sheer scale of the flagship model meant that the brand was committing vast amounts of capital to brick-and-mortar spaces. As management basked in the glory of the Kate Moss queues, they became fundamentally anchored to the physical pavement. They believed that if they built the ultimate destination, the pilgrims would never stop traveling. It was an arrogant assumption that left them completely blind to the quiet, digital revolution that was about to render these massive, expensive retail spaces dangerously obsolete. While Topshop was cementing its status as a cultural phenomenon under the quiet, meticulous guidance of Jane Shepherdson, the corporate entity that owned it was undergoing a ruthless transformation. In 2002, the Arcadia Group, the sprawling retail conglomerate that housed Topshop, Topman, Burton, and Dorothy Perkins, was acquired for £850 million by the billionaire retail tycoon, Sir Philip Green. Green was not a man of high fashion, nor was he particularly interested in the subtle aesthetics of youth culture. He was a flamboyant, cigar-smoking dealmaker, renowned in the City of London for his aggressive negotiation tactics and a relentless obsession with the bottom line. His business strategy was famously blunt: buy up British high street staples, squeeze suppliers for cheaper prices, cut operational costs to the bone, and extract maximum profit. For Green, a brilliantly tailored blazer wasn't a triumph of British design. It was simply a unit of stock with a profit margin attached. For a brief, lucrative period, the arrangement seemed unstoppable. Topshop was undoubtedly the jewel in Arcadia's crown. Shepherdson controlled the cultural output, and Green controlled the corporate margins. Topshop's soaring popularity on the high street, combined with Green's brutal cost-cutting behind the scenes, transformed the Arcadia Group into an absolute cash machine. But a fundamental culture clash was inevitable. Shepherdson viewed Topshop as a creative institution that required constant nurturing. Green viewed it entirely as a financial asset to be leveraged. The true, devastating purpose of Green's ownership was spectacularly revealed in 2005. In a move that stunned the British financial establishment, Arcadia paid out a staggering £1.2 billion dividend. It was, at the time, the largest single dividend payout in British corporate history. The money did not go to shareholders, nor was it reinvested into modernising Topshop's aging store estate across the regions, or into building the robust e-commerce platform that the brand would soon desperately need. Instead, the cheque was written to Green's wife, Lady Tina Green, the nominal owner of the Arcadia Group, who resided in the tax haven of Monaco. Crucially, to fund this colossal extraction of wealth, Arcadia took on massive loans. The retail empire was essentially loaded with debt to fund the billionaire's lavish lifestyle of super yachts, private jets, and multi-million-pound celebrity birthday parties. Topshop was systematically financially hollowed out from the inside. The war chest that should have protected the brand's future was emptied onto the shores of the Mediterranean. The breaking point between art and commerce finally arrived in 2006. Sir Philip Green, ever eager for the spotlight and celebrity association, personally brokered the monumental collaboration with Kate Moss. According to industry insiders, he bypassed the creative team entirely negotiating the multi-million-pound deal directly with the supermodel over dinner. For Shepherdson, who had spent nearly a decade building Topshop's credibility through in-house design, championing young British talent, and meticulously controlling the brand's image, this was an unacceptable compromise. Parachuting a celebrity in to take the credit undermined the very foundation of the fashion authority she had built. It was a clear signal that the boardroom, not the design studio, was now dictating the brand's creative direction. In October 2006, the news sent shockwaves through the British fashion industry. Jane Shepherdson had resigned. She walked away from the empire she had painstakingly rebuilt, leaving the brand entirely in the hands of the billionaire. Her departure was mourned by the fashion press as the end of an era. The general public did not immediately notice her absence. The Kate Moss collections launched to chaotic queues, the Oxford Circus flagship remained packed, and the tills continued to ring loudly for several more years. The sheer momentum of what Shepherdson had built carried Topshop forward. But a fatal, irreversible shift had occurred. The soul of Topshop had walked out the door. Without its creative visionary to protect the product, the brand slowly transitioned from a fashion pioneer to a bloated cash cow, entirely focused on volume and short-term financial extraction. The quality of the garments began to subtly decline. The designs became slightly more derivative, and the relentless drive to push down supplier costs took precedence over innovation. The billionaire had secured his fortune, but in doing so, he had quietly sown the seeds of Topshop's ultimate destruction. They had sacrificed tomorrow to pay for today. While the Arcadia boardroom was still intoxicated by the staggering footfall of the late 2000s, a silent, digital revolution was fundamentally rewriting the rules of retail. The rise of the smartphone and the explosion of social media were changing the very nature of how young women consumed fashion. The traditional Saturday afternoon shopping trip with friends, the cultural phenomenon that Topshop had practically invented, was slowly being replaced by the solitary act of scrolling through a screen at midnight. The high street was moving into the palm of the consumer's hand, and Topshop was woefully unprepared for the migration. A new breed of ruthless, agile competitors was emerging from the internet. Brands like ASOS, originally as seen on screen, alongside Manchester-based fast fashion titans such as Boohoo, Missguided, and Pretty Little Thing, were completely unburdened by the physical world. They were e-commerce native. They did not have to worry about outfitting shop windows, paying electricity bills for massive retail units, or staffing hundreds of tills across the country. They operated out of vast, heavily automated warehouses located in cheaper industrial estates. This stark difference in overheads allowed them to aggressively undercut Topshop on price while relentlessly outperforming them on speed. Speed was the new currency of youth fashion, and the digital natives had perfected a brutal test and repeat model. If a celebrity or a burgeoning Instagram influencer was photographed wearing a specific style of dress on a Friday night, brands like Boohoo could design a replica, manufacture it in a local Leicester factory, and have it available to purchase online by Monday morning. They were uploading thousands of new items to their websites every single week, creating an endless, addictive feed of novelty for a generation with a rapidly decreasing attention span. Compared to this hyper-accelerated digital cycle, Topshop suddenly felt glacially slow. Despite its massive resources, the brand was still chained to a traditional, physical supply chain. The buying cycle took months. By the time a trend had been spotted, designed, manufactured overseas, shipped to the UK, unpacked in a stockroom, and finally hung on a rail in a regional shopping centre, the fickle youth market had already moved on. Furthermore, Arcadia's chronic underinvestment meant that Topshop's digital presence was appallingly neglected. While ASOS was pioneering seamless online checkout, free next-day delivery, and free no-questions-asked returns, Topshop treated its website as an afterthought, a clunky, frustrating digital catalogue that played second fiddle to the physical stores. The leadership believed that their physical dominance was impregnable. They assumed shoppers would always prefer to queue for the changing rooms. It was a fatal misreading of a generation that now expected instant gratification delivered directly to their doorstep. If the digital fast fashion brands were attacking from above, A relentless squeeze was also happening on the physical pavement. The British high street was becoming a brutal battleground, and Topshop found itself trapped in a perilous middle ground. On one side was the Spanish behemoth, Zara. Zara had mastered the physical supply chain, managing to interpret high-end runway aesthetics and deliver them to the shop floor in a matter of weeks. They offered a sleeker, more sophisticated shopping environment that made Topshop's noisy, neon-lit aisles feel increasingly juvenile. On the other side was Primark, which was obliterating the bottom end of the market. Primark offered disposable fashion at prices so low, they defied logic. A teenager could buy an entire weekend outfit at Primark for the price of a single Topshop blouse. Suddenly, Topshop was suffering from a severe crisis of identity. It was no longer the cheapest option, nor was it the most fashionable, and it was certainly not the most convenient. A £45 dress that might have seemed reasonable a decade earlier now felt like a rip-off to a Gen Z shopper who could find a near-identical garment online for £15. As customer loyalty evaporated, the physical empire that had once been Topshop's greatest asset transformed into an immense, suffocating liability. The brand was tied down by hundreds of stores across the UK, many of which were locked into rigid, decades-long leases with upward-only rent reviews. Agreements signed during the boom years when retail growth seemed infinite. On top of the extortionate rent, the company was being crushed by Britain's archaic business rate system, a tax levied on commercial properties that heavily penalised physical retailers while letting online-only warehouses off the hook. The geography of British retail was fracturing. Footfall in regional town centres and tired, mid-tier shopping centres began to plummet precipitously. Yet, even as the aisles went quiet and the tills stopped ringing, Topshop's fixed costs remained astronomically high. The profit margins that had once funded billionaire dividends were rapidly evaporating. The stores themselves began to reflect this financial starvation. Outside of the gleaming Oxford Circus flagship, regional Topshop branches in places like Hull, Swansea, or Aberdeen were left to decay. The carpets grew threadbare, the lighting was poor, and the shop floors felt cluttered and chaotic. The brand had lost its edge, its speed, and its connection to the youth. The high street, which Topshop had proudly ruled for nearly 40 years, was no longer a kingdom. It was a cage, and the walls were closing in fast. Fashion brands rarely die overnight. Usually they suffer a dual death. First, they lose their cultural relevance, and later they run out of cash. By the late 2000s, Topshop was rapidly bleeding market share to its digital rivals, but its fatal wound was entirely self-inflicted. The brand was no longer just viewed as outdated. It had become actively toxic, and the source of that toxicity was the man at the very top. For years, Sir Philip Green had been celebrated by the British press as a swashbuckling retail king, even earning a knighthood for his services to the industry. But in 2016, the facade violently shattered. The catalyst was the catastrophic collapse of British Home Stores, BHS, another historic high street staple that Green had owned for over a decade. In 2015, after years of chronic underinvestment, Green sold the heavily indebted BHS for just £1 to a consortium led by a man with no retail experience and a history of bankruptcy. A year later, BHS collapsed entirely. 11,000 high street workers lost their livelihoods, and the company was left with a staggering £571 million deficit in its pension fund. It was one of the darkest days in modern British retail history. As elderly staff faced the terrifying prospect of losing their life savings, the British tabloids splashed photographs of Sir Philip Green lounging on his newly delivered £100 million superyacht, Lionheart, anchored in the Mediterranean sun. The optics were utterly devastating. He was summoned before a parliamentary select committee, where he was publicly branded the unacceptable face of capitalism. The public outrage was visceral. Though Green eventually wrote a cheque to plug the pension gap under immense political pressure, the damage to his empire's reputation was irreparable. Then came the cultural reckoning of 2018. As the #MeToo movement swept across the globe, forcing a long-overdue examination of power dynamics and workplace culture, the Arcadia boardroom found itself in the crosshairs. Lord Hayne used parliamentary privilege in the House of Lords to publicly name Sir Philip Green as the businessman behind a series of controversial non-disclosure agreements, NDAs. These legal gagging orders had been used to cover up allegations of bullying, racial abuse, and sexual harassment against the billionaire by his own staff. Green vehemently denied the allegations, but the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. For Topshop, a brand whose entire existence relied on selling empowerment, independence, and trendiness to young women, this association was catastrophic. The modern youth demographic, Generation Z, shops with its conscience. They care deeply about sustainability, ethical manufacturing, and corporate morality. Walking around with a Topshop carrier bag was no longer a badge of style. It felt like an endorsement of a toxic, patriarchal corporate culture. Protesters began gathering outside the Oxford Circus flagship, holding banners demanding better ethics and urging shoppers to boycott the brand. High-profile celebrity endorsements quietly vanished. Most notably, Beyoncé, who had launched her highly lucrative Ivy Park athleisure line in a 50-50 joint venture with Topshop, exercised her right to buy out Green's share entirely, severing all ties with the Arcadia Group to protect her own brand's integrity. Topshop was becoming a pariah in the very industry it had once ruled. While the brand's reputation burned in the national press, the physical reality of Topshop's estate was quietly rotting from the inside out. The colossal dividends extracted a decade earlier had left the business starved of the crucial capital needed to maintain a sprawling physical empire. The consequences of this financial starvation were now painfully visible on high streets and retail parks up and down the country. If the Oxford Circus flagship was an aging queen receiving just enough cosmetic touch-ups to keep up appearances, the regional stores were the neglected, forgotten children of the empire. For a teenager walking into a Topshop in a mid-sized provincial shopping centre in 2018, the experience was profoundly depressing. The sensory thrill that had once defined the brand had evaporated. The carpets were threadbare and stained. The lighting fixtures flickered or were broken entirely, casting a dull, unflattering yellow glow over the shop floor. The rails were chaotic, crammed with fast-fashion garments that felt cheap to the touch, hastily thrown together to try and chase the micro-trends that online competitors had already mastered months prior. The infrastructure of the shops was practically archaic. While competitors were rolling out self-checkout kiosks, mobile payment terminals, and slick click-and-collect services, Topshop staff were forced to use outdated, slow-till systems that frequently crashed. The changing rooms, once the epicenter of Saturday afternoon bonding for groups of teenage girls, were often messy, poorly lit, and understaffed. The mannequins were chipped, and the window displays, once the envy of the British retail sector, looked tired and uninspired, featuring recycled props and faded signage. It was an environment that bred apathy. The shop assistants, many of whom were minimum wage workers bearing the brunt of customer frustration over broken card machines or missing stock, looked just as exhausted as the stores themselves. The vibrant, rebellious energy that Jane Shepherdson had injected into the brand had been entirely drained away, replaced by the sterile, cynical atmosphere of a business that was simply trying to survive the financial quarter. You cannot successfully sell youth, glamour, and aspiration in a room that smells of decay. Consumers, even if they ignored the corporate scandals dominating the news, instinctively felt the shift. A trip to Topshop no longer felt like a treat. It felt like a chore. The brand had broken its fundamental promise to its customers. It was no longer an authority, and it was no longer a destination. As footfall across British town centres continued its merciless decline, Topshop stores transformed from bustling cultural hubs into quiet, cavernous liabilities. The Arcadia Group was trapped. They were bound to massive physical spaces they could not afford to modernize, burdened by a toxic corporate image they could not shake, and bleeding customers to a digital world they had arrogantly ignored. The storm clouds that had been gathering for years were finally ready to break. By the spring of 2019, the financial tightrope that the Arcadia Group had been walking for years finally snapped. The sheer weight of maintaining hundreds of oversized, underperforming physical stores with plummeting footfall was hemorrhaging cash at an unsustainable rate. Topshop once the invincible titan that dictated the terms of the high street, was now on its knees, facing a humiliating reality. It was completely out of money. In a desperate bid for survival, Arcadia was forced to launch a company voluntary arrangement, CVA. In the brutal lexicon of British retail, a CVA is the final alarm bell. It is a legal mechanism that allows a struggling company to essentially beg its landlords for aggressive rent reductions and permission to break leases in order to avoid outright bankruptcy. The very fact that Topshop had been reduced to this state sent shockwaves through the property and retail sectors. The brand that had once commanded the prime spots in every major shopping centre across the United Kingdom was now fighting for its life in the boardroom. The negotiations were bitter and protracted. Landlords, who were themselves suffering from the wider high street decline, were furious at being asked to swallow massive financial losses to rescue a billionaire's heavily mismanaged empire. Ultimately, they voted to approve the CVA, choosing the lesser of two evils. But the cost of this lifeline was severe. Arcadia was forced to aggressively shrink its footprint. Dozens of Topshop and Topman branches across the UK and Ireland were permanently boarded up. The brand also had to enact a humiliating retreat from the international stage, shutting down all of its directly operated flagship stores in the United States, effectively erasing its transatlantic ambitions overnight. The CVA bought Arcadia a little bit of time, a temporary stay of execution. The leadership team promised a massive digital overhaul and a renewed focus on the product. But a retailer cannot simply shrink its way to greatness, and the underlying rot remained unaddressed. Then, an unprecedented black swan event arrived to deliver the fatal strike. In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the United Kingdom. On the 23rd of March, Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced the first national lockdown. In an instant, the British high street was entirely switched off. The impact on Topshop was immediate, absolute, and catastrophic. The heavy glass doors of every single store, including the colossal Oxford Circus flagship, were locked. The tills were silenced. The escalators were halted. Almost overnight, Topshop's revenue from the physical world dropped to zero. However, the crushing liabilities remained. Even with government assistance and the furlough scheme paying the wages of the thousands of retail staff sitting at home, Arcadia was still staring at massive, mounting bills for rent, supplier invoices, and unsold inventory. The physical empire, once the source of their unimaginable wealth, had suddenly transformed into an anvil, dragging them straight to the bottom of the ocean. If Topshop had possessed a robust, highly developed e-commerce platform, it might have weathered the storm. But the years of chronic digital underinvestment now proved fatal. As the nation was confined to their homes, online shopping exploded. Competitors like ASOS, Boohoo, and Pretty Little Thing experienced staggering, record-breaking sales. These agile digital natives instantly pivoted their manufacturing lines, flooding their websites with comfortable loungewear, oversized hoodies, and elasticated joggers, exactly what a captive population wanted to wear. Topshop, by contrast, was fundamentally paralyzed. Its supply chain was too slow to react. Its warehouses and shuttered shops were packed to the rafters with thousands of sequined party dresses, structured blazers, denim skirts, and high heels, the very uniform of the British Friday night out. But there were no nightclubs open. There were no music festivals. There were no Saturday night out, no music festivals. There were no Saturday afternoon pub trips. Topshop was trying to sell the promise of a glamorous, social lifestyle to a youth demographic that was legally confined to their sofas. Even when shoppers did visit Topshop's website, the experience was clunky and the delivery options were slower than their fast fashion rivals. They had nothing relevant to sell and a poor mechanism with which to sell it. The pandemic did not create the cracks in the Arcadia empire, but it acted as a brutal accelerant. It exposed the absolute fragility of a business model that was entirely reliant on people walking through physical doors. As the months dragged on and subsequent lockdowns were announced throughout late 2020, the silence in the boardroom became deafening. The temporary life support of the 2019 CVA was rapidly running out. There were no more levers to pull, no more assets to remortgage, and no more patience from the creditors. The perfect storm had finally engulfed them. The empire was out of time, and the retail apocalypse they had arrogantly thought themselves immune to had arrived at their doorstep. The end, when it finally arrived, was not met with the bustling, chaotic liquidation queues that usually accompany a high street demise. Instead, it was defined by a cold, devastating silence. On the evening of the 30th of November 2020, as the United Kingdom braced for a bleak, pandemic-restricted winter, the news broke across national television and social media. The Arcadia Group, the gargantuan retail empire that had dominated British town centres for decades, had officially collapsed into administration. Deloitte was appointed to handle the insolvency. The corporate shield had shattered. For the 13,000 employees working across Arcadia's brands, the vast majority of whom were shop floor assistants, till operators, and visual merchandisers for Topshop and Topman, the announcement was a crushing blow. The sheer cruelty of the timing was inescapable. Thousands of these workers were already sitting at home, relying on the government's furlough scheme, nervously watching the news to see if they would have a job to return to when the national lockdowns eventually lifted. Many of them did not receive a dignified internal briefing. They found out that their livelihoods were gone through push notifications on their smartphones or frantic text messages from colleagues. The administration of Arcadia was immediately recognized as one of the most catastrophic failures in the history of British retail. It was a failure of staggering proportions. Topshop, the undisputed crown jewel of the group, the brand that had once dictated the wardrobes of millions of young women, was now effectively bankrupt. The public reaction was a complex mixture of profound sadness and bitter anger. There was an outpouring of nostalgia across social media, with women in their 20s, 30s and 40s sharing memories of their first Topshop purchases, the thrill of the Oxford Circus changing rooms, and the weekend trips that defined their teenage years. Yet, running parallel to this nostalgia was a fierce, palpable fury directed firmly at the top. The British public looked at the ruins of a beloved cultural institution and then looked at the billionaire family who had extracted hundreds of millions of pounds from it. While thousands of retail workers faced an incredibly anxious Christmas, terrified about how they would pay their rent or feed their families, the owners who had presided over the empire's stagnation remained insulated by their vast, offshore wealth. Behind the scenes, the administrators at Deloitte frantically began searching for a buyer. They were looking for a white knight who might be willing to swallow the group whole, taking on the brand, the staff, and the physical stores. But the British retail landscape had been fundamentally irrevocably scarred by the pandemic. No one wanted the immense, toxic liability of Topshop's physical footprint. The high street had become a ghost town, and the immense rent bills attached to those regional branches and flagship palaces were viewed as financial suicide. It quickly became terrifyingly clear that the physical stores, the very spaces where Topshop had forged its identity, were not going to be saved. Because of the severe COVID-19 tier systems and lockdowns that gripped the UK in late 2020 and early 2021, Topshop was denied even the dignity of a proper goodbye. There were no massive "everything must go" banners draped across the shop fronts. There were no chaotic final weekends where bargain hunters stripped the shelves bare, as had happened with Woolworths a decade earlier. For the most part, the death of physical Topshop happened entirely behind locked doors. When the final decisions were made by the administrators in early 2021, the process of dismantling the physical empire began in a sterile, heartbreaking manner. Skeleton crews of staff, many of whom had given a decade or more of their lives to the company, were asked to return to the shuttered stores, not to serve customers, but to pack up the corpse of the business. Inside the cavernous, quiet branches, the vibrant energy that had defined the brand was entirely extinguished. Staff quietly dismantled the window displays that used to dictate seasonal trends. The heavy, polished mannequins that had once proudly worn the latest hero items were stripped naked, their plastic limbs stacked haphazardly in the corners of the stockrooms. Thousands of pristine garments, party dresses that would never be worn to a nightclub, tailored trousers that would never see an office, were folded, wrapped in plastic, and packed into brown cardboard boxes to be shipped off to liquidators or wholesale buyers. The tills, which had once rung incessantly with the sound of a generation's disposable income, were unplugged and wrapped in protective film. The iconic neon signage, which had served as a beacon for Saturday shoppers in shopping centres from Manchester's Arndale to Cardiff's St David's, was permanently switched off. For the staff turning the key in the lock for the final time, it was a profoundly emotional experience. They were not just losing a paycheck, they were losing a community. The shop floor had been a place of camaraderie, of shared stress during the Christmas rush, and of pride when the store looked immaculate. Now, they were handing over the keys to administrators and walking out onto eerily quiet pavements, carrying their personal belongings in plastic carrier bags. The flagship at 214 Oxford Street, once the beating heart of London's retail scene, stood completely dark. The colossal display windows, which had famously housed Kate Moss and showcased the absolute pinnacle of British high street fashion, were now just vast, empty panes of glass reflecting the grey winter sky. The posters were peeled away, leaving only sticky residue behind. In a matter of weeks, an empire of over 300 physical shops was meticulously erased from the British landscape. The architectural landmarks of youth culture were transformed into empty, cavernous voids, leaving gaping holes in shopping centres and high streets up and down the country. The physical iteration of Topshop, the noise, the crowds, the excitement, and the undeniable cultural authority, was officially dead. What remained was merely the intellectual property, waiting to be auctioned off to the highest bidder in a retail world it no longer recognized. As the dust settled on the colossal collapse of the Arcadia Group in early 2021, the British retail industry held its breath to see who would pick over the carcass. While the physical empire was widely viewed by investors as a toxic liability, the intellectual property of Topshop still held immense residual value. It was a globally recognized name with decades of cultural cachet. On the 1st of February 2021, the definitive announcement was made. The fast fashion behemoth ASOS, one of the very digital disruptors that had relentlessly eroded Topshop's market share over the previous decade, stepped forward. They wrote a check for £265 million. In a single, sweeping transaction, they acquired the brands of Topshop, Topman, Miss Selfridge, and the activewear line, Heat, alongside roughly £30 million worth of leftover stock sitting in warehouses and shuttered shops. To a casual observer quickly scrolling through a newsfeed, the headlines might have looked like a last-minute reprieve. Topshop saved. But for the thousands of people who had built their lives around the brand, and for the local economies that relied on its footfall, it was the exact opposite. This was not a rescue of a retailer. It was the ruthless acquisition of a logo. ASOS made it immediately and brutally clear that they had absolute zero interest in bricks and mortar. They did not purchase a single physical shop. They did not take on a single commercial lease. And most devastatingly of all, they did not save the retail staff. While a small number of design and buying staff were absorbed into the ASOS headquarters to maintain the clothing lines, the shop floor was entirely abandoned. Around 2,500 retail workers were made permanently redundant as a direct consequence of this specific deal. The people who had been the face, the voice, and the muscle of the brand on high streets from Glasgow to Plymouth were left with nothing. The irony of the acquisition was palpable and deeply uncomfortable. Topshop had been fundamentally destroyed by its arrogant failure to adapt to the e-commerce era. Now its corpse was being hollowed out and worn by the very victor that had defeated it. ASOS simply took the Topshop name, stripped it of its physical heritage, and plugged it into their massive, highly automated distribution centers. This transaction marked a profound, irreversible shift in the nature of British retail culture. For over 50 years, Topshop had been a tactile, spatial experience. You went there. You met your friends outside the doors. You touched the fabrics. You carried the distinct shopping bags on the bus home. You queued under the bright lights of the fitting rooms. It was a destination. Now Topshop was reduced to a mere drop-down filter on a smartphone app. It was just one tab among hundreds of others on the ASOS website. The clothes still existed, but the context had been entirely eradicated. The psychological thrill of hunting for a weekend outfit amongst densely packed clothing rails was replaced by the solitary act of scrolling through a digital grid. Buying a Topshop dress no longer involved a Saturday afternoon trip to a local shopping centre. It involved adding an item to a digital basket while sitting on a sofa and waiting for a gig economy delivery driver to drop a plastic parcel on the doorstep. For the British consumer, the cognitive dissonance was jarring. You could still wear a brand new Topshop coat, but you could never go to Topshop ever again. Over the subsequent months, shoppers would walk down their local high streets past the dark, boarded-up shells of former Topshop branches, only to go home and receive an ASOS parcel containing a garment bearing the exact same label. The brand survived, but its soul, the chaotic, vibrant, communal energy of the physical high street, had been surgically removed. It was a stark, unyielding lesson in the modern realities of the retail industry. A brand could live on indefinitely in the digital cloud, even as the physical ground it was built upon was completely wiped clean. The British high street had permanently lost its loudest voice, and Topshop had officially become a ghost in the machine. For a time, the colossal architectural carcass of 214 Oxford Street stood as a haunting monument to the Arcadia Empire's hubris. The 90,000-square-foot palace that had once hosted Kate Moss and drawn 100,000 fashion pilgrims a week sat dark and boarded up. It was a gaping void in the very heart of the capital. But the brutal machinery of central London real estate does not pause for sentimentality. In late 2021, the ultimate symbolic insult was delivered. The lease to the iconic Oxford Circus flagship was sold for an estimated £378 million to Inca Investments, the property arm of IKEA. The cathedral of British youth fashion, the place where teenagers had practically rioted for the latest indie sleaze denim, was destined to become a showroom for flat-pack Swedish furniture and affordable homeware. The transition was perfectly emblematic of a shifting culture. The glamorous, chaotic, disposable era of the high street was over, replaced by a pragmatic, functional retail reality. Outside of London, the scars were even more visible. Across regional high streets, in mid-tier shopping centres, and on out-of-town retail parks, the physical spaces that Topshop had vacated proved incredibly difficult to fill. The units were simply too large for a battered retail sector to absorb. Years after the doors had been locked, one could still walk through a provincial town centre and see the ghostly, faded outline of the Topshop logo stained onto the brickwork above an empty shop front. They were quiet, lingering reminders of a Saturday shopping culture that had been permanently erased. Meanwhile, in the digital realm, the indignity of Topshop's afterlife was far from over. ASOS had purchased the brand in 2021, believing it would act as a golden ticket to boost their own growth. But the e-commerce giant soon found itself battling its own severe financial headwinds. As the post-pandemic online shopping boom rapidly cooled, and ultra-fast fashion rivals like Shein aggressively stole market share, ASOS began hemorrhaging cash. The savior was now sinking. Topshop, once an untouchable retail monarch, was reduced to a financial bargaining chip to balance the books. In September 2024, the final humiliating chapter of its corporate subjugation was written. Desperate to shore up its balance sheet, ASOS sold a 75% majority stake in the Topshop and Topman Brands to Heartland, an investment firm acting on behalf of the Danish billionaire Anders Holch Povelsen, owner of the bestseller retail group. The deal valued the once mighty empire at roughly £180 million, a catastrophic drop from its multi-billion-pound valuation during the Philip Green golden years. This 2024 transaction fundamentally redefined what Topshop is today. It is no longer an independent creative force, nor is it even a standalone digital destination. The deal transformed Topshop into a wholesale operation. It became a licensed intellectual property, a brand name to be manufactured by a conglomerate and distributed across various third-party websites or placed on the racks of other retailers. It was the ultimate fall from grace. A brand that had once dictated the rules of the fashion industry, that had commanded its own dedicated floor space, its own DJs, and its own fiercely loyal community, had been whittled down to a mere label sewn into the collar of a generic garment. It was no longer a dictator of youth culture. It was just a line of code on a balance sheet, traded back and forth between rival conglomerates to plug financial holes. The Topshop name technically survived the apocalypse, but in every meaningful sense, the brand was dead. The magic of Topshop was never just about the cotton or the polyester. It was about the physical authority it held over the British high street. It was about the anticipation, the music, the chaos of the fitting rooms, and the collective experience of growing up. When the heavy glass doors of Oxford Circus were locked and the intellectual property was sold to the highest bidder, that cultural heartbeat flatlined. The ghost had finally left the building. The collapse of Topshop proves that in the retail industry, nostalgia is never a viable business strategy. No empire falls from a single misstep. A brand can be universally loved, deeply embedded in the cultural fabric of a nation, and still vanish completely if its architects arrogantly believe their past victories will shield them from the future. For decades, the boardroom treated Topshop purely as a financial asset to be leveraged, entirely missing what it actually represented on the pavement. Retail, at its absolute best, is never just about transactions. It is about community, identity, and the physical spaces where we figure out who we want to be. For millions of British teenagers and young women, those heavy glass doors were a gateway to adulthood. It was the frantic search for a first date outfit, the desperate hunt for a university interview suit, or simply the ritual of a noisy, crowded Saturday afternoon spent shoulder to shoulder with friends. When the signs came down, what the UK lost wasn't just a clothing shop. It was the erasure of a tangible, shared chapter of youth. Today, the high street has irrevocably changed. The shopping centres are quieter, the regional car parks less crowded, and the tactile thrill of discovering a new trend has been flattened into the solitary act of scrolling on a screen. You can still buy a garment with a Topshop label sewn into the collar, delivered quietly in a grey plastic mailing bag. But the empire itself, the noise, the authority, and the undeniable magic of the physical space has faded into history. What was your defining Topshop memory? Was it queuing for a Kate Moss collection, finding the perfect pair of Joni jeans, or just the overwhelming sensory experience of the Oxford Circus flagship? Share your stories in the comments below. If you found this journey through British retail history insightful, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel as we continue to explore the rises, falls, and forgotten legacies of the high street we've loved and lost.